Chapter 4, Marking Territory, 1990. Other Wes's Point of View. Dude, I'm gonna ask you one more time, where did you get the money from? Tony's fists were clenched and his jaw tense as he eyed his little brother up and down. His stare was serious and his stance like that of a trained boxer preparing to pounce. Wes's body language was evasive. He refused to look his brother in the eye. Tony had come by the house that morning to see Wes and his mother. When he strolled past Wes's room, he noticed it had changed significantly since the last time he saw it. One wall was covered with a tower of sneaker boxes. Inside the boxes were a rainbow assortment of Nikes, each pair fresher than the last. The smell of barely touched leather seemed to fill the room. It was like walking in a Foot Locker. Tony found his younger brother and asked for an explanation for the leaning tower of Nikes. Wes stuttered out a story. He'd become a popular DJ in the neighborhood and was making incredible loot DJing parties. It was a story he'd used with Mary, and she'd bought it whole. Maybe because she really believed him. Maybe because she really wanted to believe him. She'd asked Wes about the shoes when they started to multiply, but after her first inquisition, she'd left the subject alone. Tony knew better. Tony had now spent over a decade dealing drugs and knew how much money could be made in the game. He also knew there was no way for someone as young as Wes to make that kind of money DJing. There was not enough records to spin, enough beats to play to buy that many sneakers. Tony grabbed Wes's shirt collar and pulled him in close. How many times do I have to tell you to leave this stuff alone, man? His tone was low and serious, but he barked his words out like a challenge as the two boys squared off on their front lawn, out of sight of Mary, who was inside the house. Wes's eyebrows arched up, and his voice rose, his best play at sincerity. I told you, man, I made this money DJing, he repeated, almost convincing himself that it was the truth. Tony closed his eyes and asked again, pounding out every word. Wes, where did you get the money? I made the money Before Wes could even finish his sentence, Tony cocked back his arm and punched him dead in the face. Wes stumbled backward onto the grass. His left eye immediately began to swell. Tony jumped on top of him, pinning Wes's arms to the ground with his knees. Once he'd locked Wes's arms down, Tony unloaded blows, striking his younger brother's chest, ribs, and face with wild abandon. Wes was trying hard to wriggle free, but his stronger and tougher older brother was getting the best of him. Mary heard the commotion and ran outside. She rushed over to the boys and tried to pull Tony off Wes, screaming for an explanation. After a brief struggle, Wes wrestled free and jumped back from his incensed brother. What the hell is going on here? Mary screamed. Wes is out here hustling. I told him to leave us alone, but he won't listen, Tony yelled back. No, he isn't. Making the money DJing. Hearing this, Tony pulled back his anger at Wes and turned it on his mother. Are you serious? You really believe that? Are you blind? Mary hesitated. Her voice was less assured when she responded. Well, that's what he told me, and I believe him. Her eyes turned to Wes. He stood about 10 feet away from them, head tilted back, trying to stop the bleeding from his nose. He suddenly jerked his head down to spit out the blood pooling in his mouth. Mary knew her younger son was no innocent. In addition to the knife fight when he was younger, Wes had been arrested a few years back after being caught stealing a car. But the sight of Tony punching Wes in the face infuriated her. Maybe it was because Wes was younger than Tony, and Mary knew, well, how violent Tony could be, or maybe it was because she wanted so much for Tony to be wrong. She knew what her older son was into, but didn't think there was anything she could do for him now. She hoped that Wes would be different. Wes was completely taken aback by his brother's anger. Tony had tried to keep Wes in school and away from drugs for as long as Wes could remember, but Tony was still deep in the game himself. Wes didn't think Tony was a hypocrite exactly. He knew why his brother felt obliged to warn him off, but it was clear that Tony himself didn't have any better ideas or he would have made those moves himself. And the truth was, Wes now had more money in his pocket than he'd ever had before, which kept him outfitted in new clothes, including the $200 cross colors set now covered with grass stains and dirt. Tony looked over at Wes, his clothes, his crisp green footwear, the laces gleaming white even after their tumble through the grass. They were a long way from their days of youthful innocence, catching lightning bugs in jars, playing freeze tag on the Cherry Hill streets, and going to the Ocean City beach on summer days with their mother. The days of using a shopping cart as a go kart, pushing it to the top of the hill and letting gravity pull them down to the bottom, were over. He realized he was staring at a mirror image of himself. You know what, Zood? I'm good. Tony was exhausted, tired from the beating he just gave Wes, tired from repeating himself. If you won't listen, that's on you. You have potential to do so much more, go so much further. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? Tony leaned over to pick up his hat. It had fallen to the ground during their fight. He spun it around and placed it backward on his head. He walked off the lawn and into the street. Mary called out to him, asked where he was going. Tony yelled back over his shoulder, "Home!" and kept walking down the block. He didn't look back again. That was the last time Tony ever tried to talk to Wes about the drug game. Mary raced over to Wes and examined his nose. The bleeding had slowed. "I'm so sorry, Wes. That's just how Tony gets sometimes." Wes looked back at her but said nothing. They walked together into the house, where Mary wet a rag and started to clean up the scrapes and bruises Tony had left on his brother's face and body. The wet rag felt good over the open cuts on Wes's face. The deeper bruise, however, Mary could do nothing about. Wes knew he was disappointing his brother, which hurt much more than the beating he'd just taken. Wes was so confused. He loved and respected his brother. Tony was the closest thing Wes had to a role model, but the more he tried to be like his brother, the more his brother rejected him. The more he copied him, the more Tony pushed back. Wes wanted to be just like Tony. Tony wanted Wes to be nothing like him. Tony's outburst did accomplish one thing, though. It motivated Mary to dig a little deeper into Wes's new income flow. The next day, after Wes went off to school, Mary began searching through his drawers. She hoped that he was not involved in drugs. Please let it be DJing money. Please let it be DJing money. She lifted his mattress and found a few extra shoeboxes under his bed. She placed them on the mattress. They were light, so she knew they didn't hold sneakers, but something was rattling around in them. As she reached for the top of one of the boxes, she pulled her hand back. She whispered to herself, "Don't ask a question unless you're ready to hear the answer." She reached again for the first Nike box and opened it. Inside were pills, marijuana, half an ounce of powdered cocaine, and half a dozen vials of Ready Rock, or crack cocaine. She felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. She sat down on the bed, unsure of what to think. She wasn't only upset about the drugs, she was upset about the lying. She didn't even bother looking in the second box. She already knew all she needed to know. Both of her sons were drug dealers. She sat paralyzed on the bed for 15 minutes before springing up, suddenly decisive. She took the boxes into the bathroom, lifted their tops, and emptied the contents into the toilet. She watched every ounce, every rock, every leaf, every crystal float to the bottom of the toilet bowl until the water was cloudy and white. She flushed it away once, and then again, and again, until the water in the bowl returned to its normal clarity. She put the tops back on the boxes and placed the boxes on Wes's bed. A few hours later, Wes walked into his room and saw the two shoe boxes. His heart plummeted. These were his work boxes. He knew he was busted. He started to think about what he would say to his mother as he slowly walked toward his bed. Maybe he would blame it on someone else. Maybe he could say he was holding them for a friend and never knew what was in them. Maybe he could say they were planted, that this was part of a larger conspiracy against him. But who would bother conspiring against him? When he reached the boxes and picked them up, he was struck by how light they were. He opened one of them and saw that it was empty. Had she thrown his drugs out? His anxiety about getting caught flipped to anger. He threw the boxes across the room. He tried to calculate how much weight he had lost and how much money he now owed the connects who supplied him with the drugs. Damn, he shouted. Ma, where are you? Do you know what you just did? I'm in my room, Mary responded. Wes stepped quickly to his mother's room, gaining anger with every creaky floorboard. When he walked into the room, Mary was calmly folding laundry on her bed. She didn't stop when he busted in. Wes was senseless with anger, but Mary just coolly looked at him, eyes opened in an expression of exaggerated innocence. Ma, do you have any idea about what you just did? Where are the drugs? I flushed them down the toilet. That was over $4,000 in drugs. I have to pay someone back for that. Wes had completely forgotten about his conspiracy argument. The only thing on his mind was trying to figure out how on earth he was going to come up with $4,000 and fast. Mary was not the least bit concerned about her son's new dilemma. Not only did you lie to me, but you were selling drugs and keeping them in my house, putting all of us in danger because of your stupidity. I don't want to hear your sob story about how much money you owe. You will stop selling that stuff. I will be checking your room, and I don't want to ever see it in here again. Now get out of my room. Wes was stunned. He went back to his room and desperately tried to devise a plan. He owed money, but had no drugs to sell. He had to figure out how to make that money back quickly. The only way to do that was to go see his connects and hit the street again. He'd realized very early in the game that the drug market was a simple supply and demand equation. The demand was bottomless. Your money was determined by how hard you worked and how feared you were. He focused. He knew the streets would get him that money back and more. But next time, he'd be smarter about where he kept the stash and how often he moved it around. Wes left the house and began to walk toward his girlfriend's place, a few blocks over. She was older, about 17. Wes complained to her about his mother's abuse of his privacy. His girlfriend sympathized. Before she realized what she was doing, she'd agreed to make her home his new headquarters. As Mary heard the door slam behind Wes, she sat back down on her bed. She pressed her fingers against her temples and began to massage them. She closed her eyes, her mind raced. Who is to blame for this? Tony? The neighborhood? The school system? Wes's friends? She put them all on trial in her mind. She was furious at Wes for what he'd done and knew that this probably would not be the end of it. Tony, who was about to become a father, making Mary a 36-year-old grandmother, had been right.